Good day. The last 24 hours have witnessed dramatic events on the battle lines in northern Donbass in eastern Ukraine. There have been now pictures of the Russian military, to be precise, of Cossack fighters from the militia of the Lugansk People's Republic and Chechen fighters from Russia's National Guard, the Rosgvardia organization, coming together in the main square, chanting slogans together, some of which include the Muslim slogan Allahu Akbar, God is great, but also Cossack slogans, all of them in a sense of extraordinary amity, right at the center of Lysychansk. And there's also pictures of a soldier, I'm not sure from which unit, but let's say he's from the Russian armed forces or allied forces, raising the red flag, the Soviet red flag, over Lysychansk. I should explain that in Russia and in the Russian-speaking world, the Soviet flag, the red flag with the hammer and sickle, is the flag of victory. It is the flag that reminds people of the victory that the Soviet Union achieved during the Second World War over Germany. And that is why Russian soldiers have, to a great extent, adopted it as they capture territory. It's not necessarily a symbol of political allegiances, but leaving that aside, they raised the flag, the victory flag, over Lysychansk, over the administrative building, which looks very badly damaged. And it seems that the entire town, or at least the greater part of the town, is now under Russian control. And again, the Russians have confirmed the name of the general who is in charge of the overall operation, which has resulted in the capture of Lysychansk. It is General Lapin. So General Lapin has captured Lysychansk. General Surovikin previously captured Severodonetsk. And over the last couple of hours, since those extraordinary pictures appeared from Lysychansk of the Chechen and Cossack forces together celebrating victory in the main square of Lysychansk, and since we saw those pictures of the red flag of victory being raised over the administrative building, we've learnt that other towns and settlements in what remains of Lugansk region have also been captured, including the small town closest to that part of the Seversky Donetsk River, where the Russians suffered a debacle some weeks ago when they tried to cross the Seversky Donetsk River and were caught in an artillery strike. Well, that particular settlement has apparently now also been captured by the Russians, and the Russian Defense Ministry, General Shoigu, the Russian Defense Minister, has now announced that the entirety of Lugansk Oblast, or the Lugansk region, is now under the control of the Lugansk People's Republic of, in effect, Russia. So the Russians have now achieved their objective of capturing the entire territory of the Lugansk region, one of the objectives that they set themselves at the start of this war. Now, in saying all of this, it's important to say that there are still large numbers of Ukrainian troops still milling around within this territory of which the Russians have achieved overall capture. There are still Ukrainian troops, as it happens, on the east bank of the Seversky Donetsk River, the part of the Seversky Donetsk River where Severodonetsk, the sister city of Lysychansk, was located. There's still large numbers of stragglers and troops, Ukrainian troops, still left there. And as I've said in previous programs, the Russians and their allied forces are going to have their hands full rounding all these people up and presumably taking them to internment camps and making of them prisoners of war. And in addition, already we're seeing large numbers of Ukrainian weapon systems, guns and whatever, which have fallen into the hands of the Russians and of the various allied militias. Now, this is an astonishing debacle for the Ukrainian side, and there's a few things to be said about it. The first is that it has happened extremely fast. Various people who have been following the events in this part of northern Donbass were expecting that the Battle of Lysychansk and of the surrounding area would take much longer than it has. I'm not sure how much longer, but anyway, they all seem to think that it would take at least a week further, more time before this area fully fell under Russian control, not just Lysychansk city, but all the areas around. And one does get the impression that Ukrainian resistance crumbled much faster than most outside commentators had been expecting. I should say outside commentators because the officials of the Lugansk People's Republic did seem to think that Lysychansk itself would fall by this weekend, even though, as I said, there were others, outside commentators, thought otherwise. They thought that Ukrainian resistance would continue for much longer than it has done. And that does beg a great number of questions. Did the Ukrainians simply, the Ukrainian soldiers, did they simply give up? Did they simply lay down their arms and run? Or was there some kind of attempt at an organized withdrawal? And given that the Russians have what's called fire control over the roads, how, if there was an order for some sort of withdrawal, how was that withdrawal carried out? Well, there are still numerous unanswered questions, but I'm going to offer my own view, which is not based upon information directly from the ground. Obviously, I'm not actually physically located in these places. I'm making this program from far away London, but I'm going to offer my own view, and it's based on Ukrainian statements and on statements that have been appearing in the Western media. I think what has happened is that Ukrainian resistance collapsed, that the soldiers basically ran away, that there was no clear withdrawal order from Kiev or from the Ukrainian High Command, and that they were not pulled back from Lysychansk in response to any such order. And the reason I am saying that is because in the hours after the news started to trickle through that Lysychansk itself had been captured and that this entire area had fallen under Russian control, in the hours that followed, Ukrainian officials continued to report that pitched battles, were already happening in Lysychansk and in the surrounding territories. Now, I can't understand why they would be doing that if they had actually given a formal order to the troops to withdraw. Even if one assumes that they delayed reporting the fall of Lysychansk in order to prepare their people, the Ukrainian people, for the fact that this battle of Lysychansk has, to all intents and purposes, ended. I would have thought that the right way to do it would have been to say that the Ukrainian command, having concluded that losses in trying to hold on to this town were becoming too high, had taken the decision to carry out a tactical or strategic withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the city, and that most of them had successfully withdrawn to Ukrainian lines. That might not be true, but that would be a much easier story to spin than to continue with claims that there was fighting going on, that Lysychansk itself is still holding out, when that is clearly not the case. And I would add that given that Ukrainians are able to go onto the internet, and apparently they're pretty internet savvy in Ukraine, as they are, by the way, also in Russia, and given that they're undoubtedly, many of them, seeing these pictures of the Cossack and Chechen troops in the main square at Lysychansk, and are seeing pictures of the flag, the red flag, being raised over the administrative building in Lysychansk, there must surely be a major hit to the credibility of the Ukrainian authorities, arising from the fact that they continue to spread this story, that there is still fighting going on, and that the city of Lysychansk is still under Ukrainian control, and that Ukraine is successfully resisting the fighting in Lysychansk, when obviously that is not the case, even if there are some holdouts and some people fighting on in some places. So that all leads me to think that the Ukrainian leadership has been caught on the hop, that they too were not expecting resistance to collapse so quickly and so suddenly, and that for a couple of hours, they, after the capture of Lysychansk, they've been denying to themselves and to their people something which they're still struggling to come to terms with, that there's been this complete collapse in Lysychansk. So I think that the fact that the Ukrainians are getting their narrative of events scrambled and confused around Lysychansk, that they're saying things which many of their own people must know are simply not true, about Ukrainian soldiers still holding out in Lysychansk, about the roads to Lysychansk still being open and the Ukrainian garrison there still receiving supplies. The fact that they are engaged in these kind of denials, all of that points to me to the underlying story, which is that Lysychansk, there was no order, no clear order ever given to pull back from Lysychansk, and that the collapse that took place in Lysychansk was one of the soldiers carried out by the soldiers themselves. Now, I'm going to go one step further, if you like, in engaging in speculations. And I'm going to say that one of the reasons why there's been this collapse in Lysychansk is not just that the soldiers there simply couldn't take any more, subjected to relentless shelling and overwhelmed by Russian attacks. I say Russian attacks by the Russians and their allies, which are now coming at them from all directions. I suspect another reason is that it turns out that as the Ukrainian army has been rebuilt by the United States over the last 8 years, since the Maidan events of 2014, the Ukrainians have apparently adopted the American method of holding back officers from the front lines. Now, I've discussed this in previous programs. There's a fundamental difference in the way that officers in Russia, in the Russian army, are supposed to act, and the way officers are supposed to act in the US military. In the Russian military, officers are supposed to lead their troops into battle. They're there, right at the forefront of their battle, with their men. They lead them into battle. They're supposed to inspire their soldiers, and they're supposed to give them courage and leadership right at the heart of the battle. In the United States military, that role is left to non-commissioned officers. Fully commissioned officers are held back in the rear. They're considered far too valuable to risk their lives in battle, in that kind of way. And of course, there's always the danger that they might be captured, which would also compromise secrets. So they're kept behind in headquarters, and they basically supervise the battle from headquarters, some distance from the actual battlefields. Let me stress again, this has nothing to do with a lack of courage on the part of these officers. It's simply a pragmatic decision based on a different assessment of how war should be fought. Now, the problem is that Ukraine is a profoundly different society from the United States. Firstly, I doubt that Ukraine has that cadre of highly trained, non-commissioned officers that you find in the US military, who are able to lead the men into battle on the front lines in the way that you find with US military. But also, Ukraine, it's important to remember, has been for nearly all of its existence part of the Russian world. And I think that the fact that their officers are not there with them in the battle will not be seen by the Ukrainian troops in the same way that it would be seen by American troops. For them, it suggests instead abandonment, that they have been abandoned by their officers and that they're not led by them into battle as they expect to be, and just as Russian officers, Russian soldiers expect their officers to lead them into battle. Now, I say this because one of the repeated themes I see coming from Ukrainian military units, Facebook pages, those sort of things, when they complain, as they now regularly do, about the impossible position that they've been put into, trying to hold front lines in Donbass, one of the regular comments that's made is that they have been abandoned by their commanders. It may work with the US military, which has a completely different philosophy and a completely different culture, and obviously a far greater depth of training. But Ukrainian soldiers belong to a different cultural world, and for them, the fact that their officers are in the rear is seen not as a rational way of conducting war. It, on the contrary, creates a sense of abandonment. And I suspect it also has another consequence. It means that when soldiers are given the order to stand and fight, in the absence of small unit commanders, their officers, they don't necessarily always fulfill those orders. Without officers present, without the kind of highly trained NCOs that the US military has in these kind of situations, it's not surprising that units of the Ukrainian army, placed under this kind of relentless pressure, crumble, as appears to have happened here in and around Lysychansk, and as has happened in other places. By the way, I suspect that this was also a factor in the rapid collapse of the Afghan army last year, as it came under the attack from the Taliban. So I just want to make that quick observation. Others may disagree, others may dispute it. It is a bit speculative, but as I said, the American way of war may work well for the US military, which has its particular set of traditions and its particular philosophy of training, but it may not be so easy to export to other armies. Armies like the ones in the former Soviet Russian space, where soldiers are accustomed to see their officers amongst them. Now, the fall of the whole Severodonetsk, Lysychansk urban agglomeration, the capture of the entirety of Lugansk region is not just a symbolic, is not just symbolic. It opens the way to further events in the war. Firstly, the Belarusian commentator who provides us with some of the most interesting commentary about the war on the Military Summary channel, which you can find on YouTube, he made what I think is a very interesting point about how the capture of Lysychansk now frees up for the Russians a large part of the railway system in Donbass, railway system that leads all the way back into Russia itself. Obviously, the railways have to be repaired. Some of the bridges have to be reconstructed. I've already discussed how this has already happened in the areas that Zaporozhye and Kherson region that the Russians have recaptured, have captured earlier in the war, how the Russians prioritized on reconstructing the road and railway links. Once they are able to do that, they're going to be able to send far more troops and, perhaps more importantly, far more heavy weapons and supplies into Donbass, which will increase the weight of armor, artillery, ammunition, all of those things that they can bring to bear across the various places, the battle lines, which I'm going to come to and discuss in a moment, the future battle lines. But it's not just that the Russians are going to hugely simplify their logistics systems, but they're going to achieve, it seems to me, something else, because, of course, the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk conurbation, as I said, I've always thought that it was dangerously undefendable from a Ukrainian point of view, that it simply was a sacrifice by Ukraine to try to hold on to it, and one which has led directly to the present debacle. But the one thing it did do is that because it was a salient that jutted deep into Russian lines, it did tie up some Russian forces. The fall of this entire area, not just Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, but the entire area of this salient, which is quite a substantial piece of territory, will enable the Russians to straighten their lines, which combined with the simplified logistics that have been provided by the capture of this large railway network, that should enable the Russians to simplify, to be able to concentrate more of their troops in fewer places, achieving breakthroughs more quickly. So they'll have shorter lines to operate on, with a railway system, a functioning railway system operating behind them, providing them with ammunition, weapons, tanks, artillery, all of those sorts of things, all operating smoothly in their rear once all that's been sorted out, something which the Military Summary channel thought might take as little as 2 weeks. So that it's quite an important event in terms of logistics. It's also, of course, important in terms of the sheer scale of Ukrainian losses. Now, about this, we remain very ill-informed. We don't know how many Ukrainian troops have been captured in Lysychansk, how many Ukrainian troops are still in the process of being hunted down and captured in all of this area of this former cauldron, if you like. And of course, we have absolutely no idea how many troops have been killed and how many troops have been wounded. But we have had admissions from Ukrainian soldiers that they have suffered extremely heavy losses in this area. In fact, there was that article in the London Times that I spoke about, and there was this Ukrainian soldier who went by the name of Vortex, obviously not his real name, who seemed to speak about massive losses. And this comes after the New York Times has in turn been writing about the fact that Ukraine is now having to plug the gap that all these enormous losses are causing by rushing to the battle lines troops that are now becoming increasingly poorly trained. So this is what's happened. Ukraine has suffered thousands probably of losses trying to hold on to Severodonetsk and now Lysychansk. Troops thrown away, either wounded or killed or captured. We don't know the total number, and of course large amounts of equipment also lost. This from a military that is becoming steadily degraded and depleted. What about the Russian side? We don't of course know exactly how many losses the Russians have suffered. But there's been a further update from the BBC. They've been trying to get a sense of the scale of Russian losses in this war in Ukraine, and they've carried out a survey with the help of Russian dissident journalists based in Russia. They've been tracking down all the cemeteries and all these places across the vast expanse of Russia. And it seems that they've been able to track down something like 4,000 dead Russian soldiers, graves of dead Russian soldiers across the whole territory of Russia since the start of the war. Now, this is obviously an increase over the previous number, which the BBC, when they did the same survey some weeks ago, I think it was back in May, they'd put it then at about, I think it was 2,500. Now it's 4,000. Well, given the intensity of the fighting, that's unsurprising. But of course, in terms of overall scale of the Russian military, 4,000 men is not a heavy total of losses. It's something that they can easily replace, particularly as more volunteers sign up, as more troops are rotated in. Now, of course, to those 4,000, one has to add the losses that the Donetsk and Lugansk militias have lost, perhaps another 4,000 as well in total. But overall, one can say with confidence that it's a small number compared to the total losses Ukraine has suffered, and Russia has vastly greater reserves than Ukraine, and important to stress, vastly greater reserves of trained manpower that Ukraine has. Ukraine may be fielding armies that number the hundreds of thousands, but those soldiers are not fully trained, and they're being rushed to the battlefield, and they're dying or being wounded, according to the Ukrainians, at the rate of 1,000 a day. The Russians have vastly larger body of trained manpower behind them. They may have only sent a much smaller proportion of their army to Ukraine. It's suffered some losses, but not crippling losses. And of course, the Russians are able to replace them, and importantly, replace them with trained men. So that's the fundamental difference. Now, of course, what I said comes from the BBC. 4,000 is, of course, a small number compared to the tens of thousands that the Western media has been talking about. One again gets the sense that the BBC is somewhat disappointed with the low numbers involved in these figures. So there we go. That's it seems to me, the state of the battle. Now, there's been some suggestions that there's going to be something of a pause as the Russians regroup and consolidate and take, as I said, round up all these Ukrainian stragglers that are still there, both east and west of the Seversky Donets River. And of course, the Ukrainians are now hurriedly trying to pull together another line of resistance from the town of Siversk in the north all the way to the important town of Bakhmut further south. The Russians, by the way, are within 5 kilometers of Bakhmut. There's just been reports that they've captured another town or village closer to Bakhmut, and there's some suggestions that Bakhmut itself is on low-lying ground. It's near a river. It's apparently much easier to capture than the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk towns would be. So this is looking like a much more fragile defense line than the one that Ukraine has just lost. It might have been possible to harden it up, to strengthen it, if resources had not been squandered trying to defend Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. But self-evidently that was not done, and now the Ukrainians are hurriedly trying to patch something together in order to hold this line from Siversk down to Bakhmut. I'm going to make a guess. I think that there will not be much of an operational pause. I think that the Russians still hold large numbers of troops in reserve. I think they'll be pushing hard against both Bakhmut and Siversk. Obviously, these are different places and different locations, but I think they'll be pushing hard against them over the next couple of days. And I think that it's highly likely that one of these places will fall. Now, I mentioned the military summary channel, which, as I said, I think is one of the best channels covering the battlefields. I will now make, as I've occasionally done in the past, my own comment upon one particular theory that the commentator who runs this channel has made. He's suggested that one of the reasons why the Russians have achieved these enormous breakthroughs in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk area is because they possess this extraordinary weapon system, the TOS, multiple rocket launch system, which launches thermobaric flamethrower type warheads, which is terrifying to the Ukrainian soldiers. Now, the TOS system is indeed one of the most powerful weapons that the Russians are deploying. It is a multiple rocket launch system. It's short-ranged, so it's completely different from the HIMARS systems that have been supplied recently to the Ukrainians. It's a short-range battlefield system. It launches far more rockets than the HIMARS does, and these rockets are relatively short-range, but what distinguishes them is that they have sort of thermobaric warheads. These are kind of fuel-air explosive warheads. They create a kind of aerosol cloud, which is then set alight, and it is indeed a terrifying weapon. It not only creates a massive sort of fireball effect, but it's one that pulls in oxygen from the areas around, and that is devastating, obviously, for the soldiers who face it. And it's incredibly powerful when used against trenches and fortifications, which is what it's designed to do. So without in any way minimizing the power and effectiveness of this weapon system, which has been used very effectively by the Russians throughout the war, I will just make one very quick observation, which is that, of course, I'm not a military person, as I repeatedly say. I take little interest, I've taken very little interest until recently in weapon systems and such things. But I'm one of these people who remains always skeptical about the effectiveness of one particular weapon as opposed to others. It always seems to me that some weapons obviously are effective, but they can only work effectively when they're used in conjunction with other weapons as in a sort of team. In other words, what wins wars is organization, training, the ability of soldiers of armies to pull all their forces together, to use all their weapon systems successfully in order to accomplish their objectives. And singling out one weapon system and saying that this is somehow a silver bullet, that in and of and by itself, this has made all the difference in the battle, I think that's a bit unwise. I think that's what the Ukrainians are doing when they talk about Western weapons. They always assume that, some Western weapon system, the M777 howitzers, the Caesar howitzers, self-propelled howitzers provided by France, the new HIMARS multiple rocket launch systems recently provided by the United States, that they in and of themselves are going to be game changer systems. I simply don't believe that. I don't think that that is how warfare works. I think that every weapon system has its role, and that a successful commander, and presumably people like General Surovikin and General Lapin, are to some extent like conductors of an orchestra. They know how to use their various units. They know what each of the units, the soldiers in those units are good for. Some of them, are best, particularly good in defense, some in attack, some are infantry, some are particularly good for infantry and, for capturing places, built up places. Others are better for holding ground, and some of them, some of the weapon systems are good for attack, some are good for defense. In other words, you play everything, all of these things, like the conductor of an orchestra. It's combined arms is what it's always talked about, that the Russians have developed this concept of combined arms, something, by the way, that they evolved during the Second World War, something which the Germans also to some extent did, to a great extent did, during the Second World War. You bring all of the various things together, your various units, your various soldiers, your various types of soldiers, your various weapon systems, and it's not one weapon system by itself that helps you win, it's their combination used effectively. Anyway, that's my own view. Anybody wants to disagree, entirely willing to write it all out on the threads and to say what they think about that. Now, I will just make one last point about the military picture, and here I'm going to come back to the military summary channel, and here I think he did make a very interesting point indeed, which is that obviously once this line from Siversk to Bakhmut is broken, which I suspect it will be, and the fact that Ukrainian soldiers now seem to be becoming ever less willing to stand and fight, as they were prepared to do earlier in the war, suggests that that battle might not last as long as some of the earlier battles have done. Then, of course, we move on to the next major concentration of Ukrainian troops in Donbass, which is the forces in the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk conurbation. And by the way, I understand that the overall command of Ukrainian troops in Donbass is located in Kramatorsk, and the Russians have been edging ever closer to both Slavyansk from the north and to Kramatorsk from the south. So you can already see the start of a pincer beginning to emerge. Well, once These forces in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are encircled or defeated. Once the Ukrainian resistance in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk is broken, then of course the entirety of Donbass essentially falls under Russian control. But the commentator on the military summary channel made a very interesting further point, which is that once Donbass has fallen, and I've discussed in previous programs how this is a very built-up area, rather like the Ruhr in Germany, relatively small industrial towns with big factory complexes, with all of them, abutting each other adjoining each other quite closely, so that where one ends, another starts. A highly defensible area in some respects. Once this area is cleared, the area to the west becomes essentially open country all the way to the Dnieper River. And he mentions the fact that apparently Western intelligence agencies have been advising the Ukrainians that they shouldn't try to defend this open area west of Donbass. They should withdraw all the way to the Dnieper River. And that would mean, in effect, that places like Zaporozhye and Dnipro, to the biggest cities in Ukraine, they will now become frontline cities, like Kharkiv is, subjected to Russian artillery. And I should add Kremenchuk as well. Now, I'm going to say straight away, I think that the Russians will attempt at some point to cross the Dnieper River. And moreover, I think that it will not be done directly against these cities. I don't think they will try to storm places, huge places like Dnipropetrovsk, as they still call it, in a head-on river crossing there. That would be an incredibly costly operation. But I think they will try to circumvent it in other ways. Now, already, of course, in Kherson region, some Russian troops are located west of the Dnieper River. And earlier in the war, when Russian troops were based in and around Kiev, there were also some of them west of the Dnieper River. They'd been able to march west of the Dnieper River from Belarus. Of course, those troops were pulled back, but it's interesting now that the Russians seem to be concentrating more and more forces closer and closer to Kharkiv, suggesting that some kind of move against Kharkiv in that part of northern Ukraine may be imminent. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. But there's been one rather interesting development, which I noticed has not received a large amount of attention. Back in March, the Ukrainians successfully sunk a Russian landing ship. The Russians had 7 landing ships in the Black Sea. A Ukrainian Tochka-U missile was able to sink 1. Well, it turns out the Russians have now refloated it, and they've taken it to Crimea for repair. And that will, once it is repaired, bring the total number of landing ships back to the original 7. What do the Russians intend to do with these landing ships? Well, I don't personally think that they're going to try a head-on amphibious assault on Odessa. I think that what they intend to do is to use them to circumvent the Dnieper River estuary. So perhaps we will be seeing some sort of amphibious assault to help the Russians bypass the Dnieper River. The Dnieper River, of course, is a river on a completely different scale from the Seversky Donetsk. So, you know, this will be a much more complicated river crossing operation. I doubt that, as I said, they'll be setting up bridges or anything of that kind, trying to set up bridges. They will do it in different ways. So we'll wait and see how that operation works out. That's probably some time away. But it's clear to me that the Russians, by raising this landing ship, are now already thinking in those terms. One last point. One of the major industrial facilities in this part of Ukraine was the Lysychansk oil refinery. And the Ukrainians tried to make it into a fortress to defend Lysychansk. And it's now apparently been captured quite rapidly by the Russians, largely intact. Now, it was the refinery that at one point was providing fuel to much of the Ukrainian army in Donbass. I doubt that's been the case for some time, by the way. But anyway, regardless, it's highly likely that the Russians will also put it to use. And along with the railway system, it could be providing fuel to the Russian military as it starts moving further west into Ukraine. Now, bear in mind that until 2014, the Lysychansk refinery was actually Russian-owned. It was confiscated from its Russian owners by Ukraine in that year. So the Russian company that operated it is still in existence, and it probably knows quite a lot about how to operate and repair it, and it can probably be done fairly fast. So all the pieces are being put in place for a very rapid Russian advance. Within a few weeks, once the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, the Ukrainian forces there, are defeated, for a Russian advance to the east bank of the Dnieper. Now, I'm going to finish this video by referring to two extremely good articles which have appeared. One is by the American scholar Gordon Hahn. He's somebody who I should say I know slightly. He's been pushed out of all of the think tanks and academic institutions where he should have been an honoured figure. He's a fine scholar. He's always been a stern critic of NATO expansion. He's also, by the way, a stern critic of President Putin himself. He doesn't like his regime very much, but he does have a very clear grasp, it seems to me, of the follies of Western policy. And he's written a very fine article talking about, and its title is Avoiding a Russian Quagmire, the Improbable Ukrainian Peace and the Risk of Direct Russo-NATO War. So it's a wide-ranging article, which I'm not going to go into. I don't agree with some points in it, but along this point, the opening point, I agree with entirely. And it starts as follows. Ukraine is losing, and it will lose its war with Russia. For Moscow not to lose the peace, it is unfortunately the case that a rump Ukraine may no longer provide, in Russian eyes, the security from the NATO-Ukraine threat it understandably to some seeks. Time is running out to avert a larger, truly Ukraine-wide war carried successfully by Moscow into the country's more anti-Russian western regions and Kiev, putting an end to the Ukrainian state in lieu of NATO military intervention. Now, I've been saying this for weeks, that the longer the war goes on, the more comprehensive Ukraine's defeats in eastern Ukraine are, the less likely it is the Russians will stop. The reason is that if Ukraine continues to reject all Russian proposals for a peaceful settlement, as they've been consistently doing, if they continue to align with the West, if they continue to refuse to cleanse themselves of the adherents of that 1930s ideology, which unfortunately I don't feel I can name in a program that's been published on YouTube, then from a Russian point of view, even a rump Ukraine remains a threat, and accordingly it becomes important for Russia to occupy all of Ukraine, as it becomes progressively easier for Russia to do. And Gordon Hahn does say that for Russia to do that risks partisan war. I disagree, by the way, on this, but let's put that whole argument to one side. But of course, it also creates massive risks of some kind of Russian-NATO confrontation, because of course, from NATO's point of view, a total collapse of Ukraine, the reoccupation by Russia of the entirety of Ukraine, could be seen by many people in NATO as a debacle that they might want to avoid at all costs. I think that is a valid fear. And Gordon Hahn suggests that to avoid all of these disasters, the Western powers ought to do what Edward Luttwak, the American geopolitical analyst, is strongly recommending. He says, Luttwak says that there needs to be a dirty, contemptible agreement. In other words, Ukraine needs to accept, and the Western powers need to accept, that only a rump Ukraine is all that's going to be left, and it has to be a rump Ukraine that is demilitarized and neutral and is no longer a threat to Russia. And Gordon Hahn then goes on to say, unfortunately, wild-eyed idealists such as those that now inhabit the corridors of power in Washington, Brussels, and elsewhere elsewhere in the West, do not do such agreements. Ask any American conservative or Republican, and that bodes poorly for the future. I entirely agree. We're working towards a debacle. I personally think we will not see a huge partisan war or a Russian quagmire in Ukraine, but we will see a massive debacle, and that a massive debacle for NATO and for the Western powers. And that brings me now to an equally fine article, this time in National Review, an establishment US publication, which you could almost say is neocon central. And it is by one of the editors of National Review, Michael Brendan Doherty, and its title is How to Lose Big in Ukraine. And it makes some incredibly valid points. It makes the point that Russia made numerous efforts to try to settle the conflict in Ukraine, and found that the Western powers simply were not interested. The West never grasped how important Ukraine is for Russia, or the price that Russia was prepared to pay to resolve the situation in Ukraine, and that Russia is now pushing forward to achieve total victory in Ukraine. And he, in addition, makes a further point. He makes the point that this Western policy of trying to strengthen Ukraine in order to weaken Russia is putting at risk the opposite. He puts it like this: one risk of making your rivals' wars more costly is that you just might make their eventual victory even larger. If the Ukrainian army fails to make a crucial strategic retreat and is broken in the cauldrons of the Donbass, the United States will have made Russia's victory much costlier, but also much more significant than it would otherwise have been. Putin will be able to claim he defeated not just the nationalists in Ukraine, but the Western powers that funded and trained their army from 6,000 to nearly 500,000 men. 6,000 being the total number of troops ready for combat that Ukraine had at the start of 2014 when the Maidan events took place in Ukraine and the political system there changed. And the US built up this Ukrainian army, which was 6,000 effectives in 2014, into a force of 500,000 men, and that army has now been destroyed. And he goes on to say, after the humiliation in Afghanistan, it would be the second massive US-funded and trained army to be defeated in the space of 2 years. That is the real risk we are taking. And it's not one that is going to leave NATO reinvigorated in the end. More like panicked and on the run. By so proudly and raising the stakes, Western policy influencers now face impossible choices that no one is prepared to make, between the choices being between accepting a humiliating peace or an utter debacle. And then the article finishes, is it a good thing for NATO to have two American-funded, NATO-supported armies destroyed in just 2 years? Well, of course, the question answers itself, of course not. So there we are. There are clever people in the United States that a wise US administration might have heeded. People like Gordon Hahn and Michael Brendan Doherty. It's those people that you should be seeing in the US National Security Council and in the corridors of power in Washington. Instead, we get all kinds of strange ideologues, people like the Kagan family, which of course includes Victoria Nuland, people like the former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, and they have led the United States, or they're leading the United States in Ukraine to what is increasingly looking like a disaster, just as their neocon brethren eventually led the United States to disasters in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places. If a future US administration wants to pursue a more realist foreign policy, one better suited to American needs, one which will avoid these debacles, well, there are people like Gordon Hahn and Michael Brendan Doherty there in the United States, writing wisely and sensibly. I don't always agree with what they say. Much of the time I don't. People like all kinds of people, Jatras, former State Department official, all sorts of people, Peter Van Buren, they're all there. You can find them, you can bring them together, you can install them in the National Security Council, and you can get a real foreign policy team together, which can put the United States on a trajectory to success based on a realistic assessment of what is happening and what the true risks for the United States are and what the real opportunities are. Will that ever happen? Can't say. I think it's very likely. But if we continue on the present trajectory, it won't be, because councils of wisdom in the United States were not there. Well, this is another program that's almost lasted an hour. I'm going to stop now. Remember, you can find us on Rumble and on Locals, especially on Locals. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Please remember our shop, where you can buy all sorts of amazing things like our wonderful mugs and hats and hoodies and t-shirts and all the rest. And please also remember to check your subscription and tick the like button if you've liked this video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.